Hello, everyone. Welcome to CultureTalk, where we share insights and learnings from leaders in arts and culture. Today, we're exploring how one of opera's most innovative leaders is transforming an art form often perceived as exclusive into something that's urgently relevant and deeply moving. Naturally, that means I'm joined by Sue Elliott today, General Director and CEO of Calgary Opera. Sue brings nearly 2 decades of experience revolutionising opera programming, having previously led groundbreaking initiatives at Houston Grand Opera and Seattle Opera. Her work commissioning locally rooted operas from stories of Salvadorian migrants to Japanese American incarceration during World War II has redefined what opera can achieve, and as you'll hear later, how powerful immersive storytelling can be. Beyond these individual productions, Sue's approach challenges fundamental assumptions about how opera engages with communities, telling stories that reflect the lived experiences of diverse audiences whilst maintaining the art form's unique power to combine music, narrative, and spectacle into transformative experiences. Hi, Sue. Before we Great. Before we dive into your revolutionary work, I'd love to hear a bit more about your journey and what drew you to opera, both as an art form and a vehicle for social connection.
Sure. Thanks, Matt. It's a pleasure to be with you today. I would say that my pathway to opera was a bit accidental. I grew up training to be a performing classical musician. I play both the clarinet and the piano and thought that was going to be my life. Certainly, it's your identity when you're studying so seriously as a youngster. Um, and along the way, I actually started to experience some playing related injuries. And while I was finishing my performance education in university and conservatories, I also started to stage manage in opera through a work study grant and then an apprenticeship program. And that was really helping me pay the bills to buy my clarinet reeds and buy new instruments. And when my injuries became so severe that a career in performance really wasn't pragmatic, I just stepped sideways into that thing I was already doing, opera stage management, did a couple of additional apprenticeship programs, and then was hired by Houston Grand Opera to join their stage management team. And since that time, I've spent almost my whole career in opera with a few adventures in related or similar arts organizations. But I've really spent my professional life devoted to opera and to its future. So that's how I ended up here. And boy, oh boy, if there's a silver lining to what many musicians have to grapple with as a career ending injury, I feel like I won the lottery in this case.
And as we'll hear about later, there's a very distinct style, this documentary journalistic style to your approach to opera. Was there a particular moment, a cultural moment in your life that shifted your perspective to that way of storytelling and that particular art form?
For sure, and this is not quite to the full-on documentary style, but early in my time at Houston Grand Opera, after finishing stage managing there and moving into more community development work, I received a call from a board member one day who was also the board member for a program called Open Door Mission that was a rehabilitation and transitional living program for men who'd experienced housing insecurity and health issues related to substance use disorder. And she called and she said, "We have these folks who are with us for many months at a time, and one of the pillars of our service to these men is to connect them to other experiences that they may not have had in their lives." And she said, "So I'd love to bring them to the opera." I said, "Fantastic. Cannot wait to welcome them. We'll bring them to a dress rehearsal because that makes it super easy for everyone. But my condition is I want to come and have a conversation with them first." And so she readily agreed to that. So there I go. This was the days of boom boxes still. So I went over to the mission with a boom box, and the opera that they were going to attend by Giuseppe Verdi called Rigoletto. And Rigoletto is the story really of King Francis I in real life, fictionalized to avoid the censors in 19th century Italy. But the title character, Rigoletto, is the court jester, and he has a daughter. And as opera is wont to do, it's a tragic story that involves the daughter and the duke, in this case of the court, who ends up having her killed near the end of the opera. And so when I sat around this table at the Open Door Mission to open a conversation with the folks who would be attending, I asked them one question that I think no one, including myself, expected. And that was, what's it like to live with stigma? Because Rigoletto, the title character, is often portrayed with a physical deformity, often a hunchback. Um, and part of the circumstances that are in play when the opera starts is the treatment of Rigoletto by the courtiers and the Duke, in part because of his court jester status, and in part perhaps because of the physical deformity. And so that moment in time was the first time I think I had embraced and explored a connection to a long ago, far away story with the here and the now and the audiences who would actually be experiencing it. Suffice it to say, it was a great experience for most of those folks. And I think that collaboration still exists, many, many years later.
And we'll hear similar stories similar to that as we go on to talk about some of the other productions. But another thing I'd like to learn from you is, you kind of touched on it there. You clearly have an interest in people and people's stories. And I'm interested throughout your journey what you've learned about what audiences actually want from opera and how you've implemented that at your various roles in the sector.
Sure. I think the key is to understand that every audience member comes to opera or to any version of the performing arts for their own personal reasons. And we know these days some folks come to escape the news. We know that some folks come because they really enjoy the spectacle and they try and figure out, how are we making all of that theatrical magic happen on stage? Other folks come because there's a particular melody from an opera that has seen them through a very tragic time in their life. Other folks come because they feel compelled to support arts organizations which are good business for good, which are devoted to creating more civil societies. And so I think, I guess if there's one rule, it's that there are a lot of different reasons why people come to the opera. And so being artistically humble and ensuring that we are being invitational and welcoming, no matter what the reason is that people are connecting with us, super important. One of the things that I hear from people all the time today is, "Oh, I'm a little worried about coming because I don't know what to wear." And I'll say at Calgary Opera, we have a very simple rule: wear something. Um, we're a proud Canadian city in the prairies. And so come in your cowboy hat and boots, come in your pearls, come with your bow tie, come dressed as a character. No matter what, wear something and come and see us.
Great. Sounds like a great ethos to follow. I'd like to move on to one of the productions that we'll be talking about today, The Refuge, which is about a Salvadorian woman whose story became the centerpiece of Houston Grand Opera's community engagement work. Can you tell us a little bit about this production and the story behind it?
Sure. This production was conceived for a couple of different purposes in Houston Grand Opera's history. It was one of the signature projects that a then new general director, Anthony Freud, wanted to help set the tone for his tenure as the company's new leader. It was also a celebration of the Opera House, the Wortham Theater Center, um, in a way to invite the entire city of Houston into the Opera Center. And it started, the definition that I hold for opera, that we certainly held in Houston under Antony's tenure, is that opera is simply music and stories that work together. It doesn't need to be historical Western European music. It doesn't need to be stories from long ago and far away. And what can we do to connect with people for whom there is no word opera in their first language? You know, Houston at that time and still today is considered a majority minority city in the United States, which means that people with a Western European cultural background are in the minority. And as Anthony and I were envisioning, you know, the future of the opera company 20 years, 30 years, 50 years in the future, we realized that we had to find a way to make opera relevant to folks who weren't Western European in their ancestry. And so this was one of the projects with which we did this. And up until that point, Houston, under David Glauckley, had had an incredible track record of commissioning new operas, on average about one a year, which at that point in the United States was well, ahead of every other company. And so Anthony said he wanted to take that commissioning muscle that the company knew how to do so well and really feature stories of today about Houstonians. And it just so happened that Anthony, in his sort of first 6 months, was talking with one of the opera's donors. And she introduced us to this woman who had walked to Houston from El Salvador and whose son had crossed the border holding on to the bottom of an 18-wheeler at the age of 8. And there's no question, just in giving that very short, tweet length synopsis, that that's a story of immense emotion, of grand scope, and yet so very personal, and a story that you hear every day in Houston, Texas. And so we engaged a composer and a librettist, someone to write the music, someone to write the words, with the understanding that they weren't going to necessarily get to choose the plot for the opera and that we didn't want it fictionalized, but that we were going to, with the help of the mayor and folks in the refugee and immigrant services sector, we were going to introduce our librettist to hundreds of people who were recently arrived to Houston from 6 or 7 different areas of the world. And we were going to put together a piece that told those stories. And I will say it was a very iterative process. That's not the kind of way operas have been typically developed up until then. And so what was key about that is that everybody was artistically humble and everybody was willing to learn as we went. And so we collected all of these stories. We recorded them with really high fidelity audio equipment. We hired a professional photographer to take photographs of all of the people we had interviewed. And then when the piece finally made its premiere at the Wortham Theater Center, elements of those photographs formed parts of the scenery. Some of the little audio clips of folks in the course of telling their story are actually integrated into the score. And it turned into an extraordinary exploration of home and sense of place. And I'm thrilled to say that through the many international, national, and local partnerships that we forged with the idea of home and sense of place, and that included organizations like Doctors Without Borders and the National Geographic magazine, and then some local Houston organizations as well, we actually engaged with 234,000 people over the 18-month period of the Refuge Project. And I believe that for the majority of Houston, it almost instantly transformed the perception of what opera could be.
The level of community engagement you got there and interest in the production is remarkable. And for those who maybe aren't so familiar with opera, they might be surprised to hear you use such strong journalistic and documentary style approaches to opera. How do you bring those two worlds together, and what risks are involved when you're kind of merging documentary style with opera?
For sure. There's a great example of a risk and a solution, if you will, with the story of the refuge creation. And I'll just preface this by saying Anthony Freud, working in Houston, Texas, a British man, me, actually, a Canadian woman. And so we grew up in very different worlds than the United States, very different news environments. And I remember that Antony had shared some excerpts of the words of the opera pretty early on with a few donors. And one day he got a call from one of these donors, and she said, "My goodness, Antony, you are so courageous." And he it was sort of said, Tell me what you mean, tell me a little bit more about the courage that you're seeing here." And I remember the opening lines of the piece at that point. They laid pipes in the streets where we walked. Fish die, people die, and on from there. And this was a story about Nigeria, and specifically about the Niger Delta, which oil companies, multinational oil companies. It's a very rich, has rich deposits of oil, and so there was huge environmental impact from the oil extraction, the fossil fuel extraction in the Niger Delta. And in fact, I have a National Geographic magazine on the bookshelf behind me that has a cover story on the Niger Delta and the fossil fuel extraction. And you see the cover image for that story is like the main street of a town with these huge pipes running down it, and a woman with walking along the pipes away from the camera with a shell umbrella. And so what this donor had called to say was, how courageous of you to essentially indict oil companies in the first few minutes of this new opera in Houston, Texas, where 80% of business is related in some way to the energy business. And we had already formally accepted the words of the opera from the librettist, which is a kind of legal thing. And so we actually did go back to the librettist, Leah Lax, and say, hey, we're getting this feedback. And what essentially, we want to have a conversation about us changing the words. And, in the olden days, that's called censorship. And what we said to the librettist, Leah, was we want to make sure that everybody is in this with their hearts from the very beginning till the very end of the opera. And so we don't necessarily want the first verse to make people super, super angry. And we didn't change the words very much. And so the meaning and the environmental impact of the fossil fuel extraction is still pretty clear in the libretto as it is sung. But we did ask her to back off and are very grateful that she agreed to that. That's a very specific example, but I think also this idea of artistic humility is so key in what we do in this way, and quite frankly, in anything we do, even if it's an opera by Mozart, because opera has been perceived as elitist, as unapproachable, as not for me. And those of us who love it and work in it understand that it's really about timeless stories. That we still see playing out today in modern contemporary life in 2025. And so I think that's the power of that, combined with this artistic humility in welcoming stories that can be shared with the company to then share with audiences, I think is super important. And the other thing that I think we made this decision really very early on in the refuge, and it held for all of the subsequent works that I've done in this style that really explore and celebrate contemporary stories. And that is that it's more journalistic in a way. Yes, it's an artistic presentation of this, but what we do is we don't tend to generalize and we don't tend to proselytize. We just tell the story. And I think that keeps it away from politics. It keeps it away from us alienating folks who we really want to listen to that story and open their hearts up to whatever it tells them and what it tells them about other people. So I think those are some of the things that have been embedded in my approach since the early 2000s when we kicked off that refuge project.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of this kind of personal journalistic style of storytelling. It's a great way to bring people into something that they might not normally feel they can approach in other kind of formats. But obviously, this kind of format involves a lot of interviews, and throughout a lot of your productions, you mentioned that you interview hundreds of people, often quite, often involving quite personal interviews about their lives. How do you navigate the ethical responsibilities of representing real people's experiences on stage?
Um, the first is that people come to us willingly to share their stories, oftentimes through community leaders or community influencers in their community with whom the opera company has established a relationship. I think that's key. I think being very clear when they are sharing their information, what is it that can be shared? Are there elements that you've shared with me here today that you would prefer not be publicized? And I think also sharing the context and the goals of the experience. It's easy to imagine that the stories that one is telling in this work, that those are designed for the community whose stories that reflects, but actually it's the very opposite, right? We didn't need to tell the audience of Jews from the former Soviet Union, one of the movements in the refuge, what their experience was like living in the Soviet Union and being not allowed in the strongest way to practice their religion. Um, we didn't need to tell them their story, they know it. So really it's for other people. And I find, generally speaking, again, with this artistic humility, with building bridges before you get to story collection, that generally speaking, people are willing to have their story shared. And I will say that in the refuge and in some of the other projects I've done, many of the folks we interviewed, that's the first time they'd told their story at all. They didn't tell their kids, because when they arrived in Houston, they wanted to move beyond that, right? It was about
Mhm.
survival. It was about establishing them and their families in this new place. And they didn't want to revisit the story either for themselves or to kind of pass along that trauma to their children or their neighbors. And so, there's a real responsibility and privilege that comes with collecting these stories and finding ways to share them respectfully. And I think it's also it's important not to change the story unless you're really clear at the very beginning that there's going to be some fictionalized elements.
Mhm. I'd like to move on to another powerful piece that you've been involved with at Seattle Opera, the piece about Japanese American incarceration. Can you walk us through what audiences experienced from the moment they arrived at the Opera House for this piece?
You bet. And this was a big risk for the opera company, quite frankly. And what inspired us to change the way in which the audience arrived at the opera house and got to their seats was really the opening scene of this opera. As you mentioned, this was an opera that explored the story of a Japanese American family being forcibly removed and incarcerated from their Bainbridge Island home during the war. And that was the first place that Japanese Americans, innocent civilians, were taken from their homes in the United States. It expanded after that. But it's a unique moment of history that we felt compelled to share. And the first scene of this opera, when the curtain goes up, the family is gathered around a wood stove and they are throwing their family photos into the fire. And the reason they're doing that is that they've heard the FBI is looking for people who might be enemy combatants living in the United States to take them away, and they wanted to get rid of any ties to their history of Japan, and that meant throwing out some of their most precious possessions. And well before this piece was finished and before it came to the stage, I would just be in the lobby when audiences are arriving for the opera and hearing them talk about traffic on the way to the theater, or I haven't seen you in 6 months. How's your daughter Susie doing? Or all of this like definitely community building chatter, but so banal. And I just thought, how are we going to get people from that chitty chat into this really, really somber moment in a way that helps them take the most emotion away from it? And so I had seen a Liz Lerman project in Washington, D.C., where they had, before the show opened, you could wander backstage and they had all of these kind of still life-size dioramas of action related to the story of the play, but not necessarily directly part of the plot. And you were immersed in that world before the play started. And so what we did at McCaw Hall in Seattle is that we locked all the doors except for the main set of doors when people were arriving, but we didn't put up any signs or tell anybody that that's what was happening. So if you went to the doors closest from the parking garage, they were locked and you couldn't get in. So eventually, people then made their way around to the main set of doors, which were open. And when they walked in, they were actually greeted by actors dressed in military uniforms, armed guards, if you will. And there was a whole wall of barbed wire that you could see as soon as you walked in. And you that was in the time when we didn't have e-tickets, so your opera ticket was taken from you, and you were given a manila tag that was pinned to the coats of the Japanese Americans when they were taken away from their homes. Now, in this case, on the back of the manila tag was a QR code, and that took people directly to an oral history of someone's story in the oral history collection project called Densho in Seattle. So we were connecting people with someone real on the back of that manila tag. But then once you'd gotten your tag, you weren't actually kind of allowed to go where you would usually go in the opera house or straight to your seats. You had to head through one lobby where there was a replica of the horse stalls, which is where the families were taken before the camps were finished. And they lived there, some of them for up to a year or more. Then, if you wanted to go to one side of the theater, the auditorium, you had to walk along a hallway where we had enormous reproductions of the Ansel Adams propaganda photos from the camps, which showed this sort of serene pastoral lifestyle completely at odds with the actual experience of those Japanese American families. And then once you got to your seats, the opera didn't start right away. We had a moderator interview 3 people who were in some way connected directly to these stories. So, a child of Filipino farm workers, and it was the Filipino farm workers who kept the farms running while the Japanese American families were incarcerated. And so, in that way, we also really brought to the fore that these are real people's stories. Then the curtain came in, we cleared the interview set, curtain went back out. The opera started with that scene of throwing photographs into the fire. And I had moved on from Seattle by the time opening night happened, but I was grateful to be invited back for the performance. And I can say that it was one of those nights in the theater that no one forgets.
You told the story to me before, and I still find it incredibly powerful. The story. I can't imagine what it must have been like for the audiences who had no prior warning at all. What they were to expect. What was their reaction like?
Well, I think people were for sure taken aback by armed guards when they walked in the theater, right? But we did that on purpose. And it didn't take folks very long to understand what was really happening. I will say that. One should never underestimate our audiences. And we did have mental health support on site in the case survivors or their family members, the re-traumatization was too much for them. But I think also we had done so much work in the community leading up to that. Again, it was based on stories that we collected. In this case, it was the story of Mary Matsuda Greenwald, who was a young girl when she was forcibly removed, and she collected tiny little shells left over from an ancient ice age where the camp was actually located. And you see, we'd done a big interview project in collaboration with the Museum of History and Industry about 2 years prior, and Mary came with her jar of shells. So, we had done a lot of communications and storytelling and story gathering in advance of this project. And so, it had the effect that we wanted it to, for sure. And that production now has, I think, been performed 12 or 14 times all across the United States and in Japan, Alaska as well. And so what we know is that it was a story that many opera companies felt compelled to share with their community.
I love that it blends so many different elements of the arts and culture sector. Obviously, you got the opera, there's the immersive experience as well as when you enter the doors. There's also elements of museums and collections there in terms of the manila tags directing people to individual stories. What was it like bringing all those different elements together? I mean, a lot of those different elements are not the normal things that operas do. So, did it require acquiring new skills, working with different partners? How did that all work?
Yeah, I would say that, this approach, which started with the Refuge, in late 2005, early 2006, and, I think the An American Dream opera about the Japanese incarceration, it was premiered in 2015. So, there's quite a period of, time under which more of these projects have been done in this way. I would say that my inspiration for a lot of these extra opera connections, if you will, I'm a little bit neurodivergent. I connect things that a lot of people don't connect necessarily. So, when we were doing The Refuge and it's about home and sense of place, our collaboration with Doctors Without Borders was to bring their exhibit called Refugee Camp in the Heart of a City to the front plaza of the Opera House. And so people actually, on their way to the refuge, walked through a replica of a refugee camp. There were Doctors Without Borders staff and volunteers on site explaining about the peanut nutrition, that can feed someone in a small tablet for a whole day. And the way in which, because we were featuring stories of refugees in that piece, right? And so with this, it's a little bit entrepreneurial. It's a little bit, how does this story connect to other stories? And it's a whole lot of collaboration. And one of the unique value propositions of opera is that it's the most collaborative form of the performing arts because you have story, you have singing, you have instrumental music, you have fashion in the costumes that are being worn, you have architecture in the scenery, you have history or journalism in the stories that are being told. And all of that has to work together and the curtain has to go up on time, right? And so when you think about opera as a model for a more collaborative society and you open yourself up to, it can be any music, any stories that work together, and then you bring in all of these other connections, I mean, it just kind of feels like normal to me now, but I can understand that certainly at that time it was unprecedented.
Yeah. And I'd like to talk about shock as a technique as well, because obviously when audiences went first came in through the door, they probably had a bit of a shock. And shock is obviously a classic technique that storytellers have used for millennia to engage audiences. Obviously, sadly now I feel the technique is a little overused and a bit cliche thanks to rage bait on social media or the abundance of sensationalism. But you've used it to great effect. So I wondered, what can others learn from how you've adopted shock as a way to engage audiences?
Sure. If I may, I might recharacterize it as surprise or
Mm,
cognitive dissonance, because I think sometimes shock is for shock's sake
mm.
rather than to open people up to a stronger connection. Um, and that idea is not necessarily brand new with this approach. I think of a French opera by Francis Poulenc called Dialogue of the Carmelites, which takes place during the French Revolution, and it follows the story of a cloister of Carmelite nuns who eventually are put to death by guillotine. And the last scene of the opera is all of the nuns. I think there's 13, don't quote me, they're singing a Latin chant beautifully at the end, and interspersed with the Latin chant are the sound of guillotine falling. And after the guillotine falls, every time one less singer is singing until you finally have just one singer. Then you have the last guillotine sound, and the orchestra ends the opera. And so Opera has always been about really big stories, big joy, big tragedy, big melodrama. In a way, it's endemic to the art form because if it wasn't something big, you wouldn't sing, right? You would just speak. Um, and so I think um, perhaps what is most unique or novel in this experience is that we're hoping to evoke the same scope and level of emotion with stories from today, not stories from a long time ago. So perhaps that's the hurdle or the process that we're asking our audiences to go through. And I remember I had a very good friends who were familiar with opera in Houston when we were putting together the Refuge, and then one of the subsequent projects, which was the world's first mariachi opera about a family split by the U.S.-Mexico border. And I brought this couple with me to opening night of the mariachi opera because they'd helped me navigate some of they'd helped me learn more about Mexican and Central and South American culture because they were Mexican and Venezuelan. Um, and so I brought them to opening night, and it was a fantastic opening night. This is a mariachi opera, right? Which had never been done before, to our knowledge. And at the end, when the mariachi band and the singers were taking their bows, Juan turned to me in the audience. He was clapping or standing up, and he said, "Oh my God, Sue, now I understand Italian opera." And I mean, he'd been to opera his whole life in Mexico at the Bellas Artes before he moved to Houston. But just seeing a story that was more familiar to him, hearing what is, perhaps Mexico's most popular traditional folk music on an opera stage really transformed for him his understanding of the entire art form. And man, for me, that was like a big win.
What do you think that reveals about the universal qualities of opera, that you can bring mariachi and opera together in a single performance, and people who aren't familiar with opera necessarily will understand it?
Sure. I think musical storytelling is as old as recorded history.
Mm.
And country and western, those are 3-minute operas. Mariachi songs also about 5-minute operas in terms of the path that characters take through those stories. And so I believe that if you tell really powerful stories that are timeless, but specifically so, and you tell that with music that matches the story, that folks who might not have ever considered opera or who might have, experienced only one kind of opera up until that point, I think you can bring them along. Not everybody even likes a Mozart opera when they come and see it, and we would consider Mozart one of the greatest opera creators in, recorded history. So I just think that when you are telling these timeless stories with great music that matches the story, that most people are along for the ride.
You mentioned to me before as well that the traditional opera audience were initially a bit shocked by people singing along to the mariachi opera songs. How do you prepare classical subscribers to opera for these experiences so that they're not alienated?
Yeah, I mean, what I would say is that was not a subscription opera. That was, people weren't baited into buying it as a package deal and not knowing what it was. And that opening night of that opera, I would say about a third, so about 700 opera fans were in the house, probably 1,000 mariachi fanatics, because one of the lessons that we learned in putting the mariachi opera together is that we couldn't convince anybody it was a good idea at first. Folks who come from the mariachi tradition said, well, there's no new mariachi music. We just rearranged the old standards. And folks, in Mexico City and in other places living in Houston from Mexico who were real opera fans said, why on earth would you ruin opera with mariachi? Like, it's a folk music for funerals and weddings and quinceañeras, and like, that's not opera music. And so when we were facing some of this resistance in testing the idea among audiences and donors in Houston, I said to Anthony, we have to find the best mariachi band alive. Like, we need credibility here. I'm Canadian, you're British, you know? Um, so we did, and with the help of the Consul General of Mexico in Houston and the cultural attaché, I, for good, stalked Mariachi Vargas de Tecalitlan all around the world for about a year, and finally convinced them and their music director at the time, Jose Pepe Martinez, that he should compose the mariachi opera and that they should do the premiere. Um, and it was quite a journey to get them to agree, but it was the right choice. You know, we didn't know what the right choices were when we were facing all that resistance, but that definitely worked. They were like, I mean, Pepe was John Lennon of mariachi, and Mariachi Vargas is like the Beatles. And so once we had that kind of credibility, a lot more doors opened. But then it came with conditions. And I remember talking to Pepe about how opening night would work of the opera. And it was about, I don't know, 70 minutes long of music to fit on one CDs at the time. And Pepe said, "Oh, no, no. If Vargas is playing the premiere, we're starting with Vargas music." And we said, "Oh, Pepe, people come for the opera." He said, "No, no, no. Our fans, if they do not hear us first, they will be angry." And of course, we don't want angry fans, right? Some of whom might have been in the Wortham Theater Center for the first time if they were coming just because Vargas was playing. And so indeed, they walked out on stage. The mariachi crowd went wild. They picked up with Guadalajara, which is one of the all-time favorite standards of mariachi, and all the mariachi fans in the audience started to sing along. And I watched, and all the opera folk were like turning around, kind of in amazement. But it was absolutely infectious, pre-COVID, infectious in the right kind of way. And it just created this celebratory, community-based experience that we could never have predicted.
You kind of touch on a lot of the risks there, and obviously, when you always seem to be pushing the boundaries, and there is obviously an element of risk attached to that. And you've kind of alluded to how you navigate some of that in terms of collaborating with various performers, the artistic humility, talking to donors, and talking to the local community. Is that always your approach to kind of mitigating risk when you're kind of experimenting? Because often when someone is experimenting, you can sometimes go too far and it no longer becomes opera, or it becomes irrelevant, or it becomes experimentation for the sake of experimentation.
Sure. I think that really encapsulates most of the risk mitigation. I would also say that the community aspect of this, that's where it actually has to start.
Mm.
In the early days of the refuge, we went out to a Latin American arts center in Houston, presented this great idea to them, and the artistic there looked at me. Um, and we were talking about, people crossing the border, and we had the story of the woman who'd walked from El Salvador to Houston by that time, and he looked at us, like, straight in our eyes, and he said, "For many of us, the border crossed us. We did not cross the border." Super true. Fact, right? Because the Mexico-US border changed quite a bit over the course of that history. And so it was an absolute no at first from that art center. We persisted. We kept in touch with them. We shared the stories as we were collecting them. We invited them to workshops of early parts of the music. And in the end, they ended up hosting a concert of the movements of the refuge that explored Central and Mexican and the Salvadoran stories, because each movement of the refuge was actually premiered in its own community first before we put it back together, all together at the Opera House. And then when we ran into trouble with the mariachi opera in terms of getting money for full-on productions, money for recording, all of these kinds of things, we ended up going back to this art center. This was 4 years after the refuge. And we did a fully staged production there with a university mariachi band that we filmed. And then that film is what we were able to shop with opera companies all around the world. And, as of 2025, so that's 15 years after the premiere of the mariachi opera, I think it's sold out in more than 30 cities now, including the Châtelet in Paris, and all across the United States. There are 3 or 4 more mariachi operas now that have been commissioned since then, and that particular opera has been rescored for orchestra, so it can be performed by even more companies. So there's always risk, there are always obstacles. I'm a bit persistent, as are most artists and most opera administrators when we believe we have a story that the world should hear.
A slightly simple question, which the answer may be obvious, but obviously there's a lot of work, a lot more work involved, it seems, when you're experimenting and pushing boundaries. And some organizers might think, oh, maybe we'll just put on a more conventional opera. But is all the extra work worth it?
100%. Opera audiences have been in decline for a while. The pandemic accelerated some of those shifts. I am absolutely convinced that the power of story, the power of musical storytelling is as potent as ever. And that, we're working to shift our business models and the way in which we engage people in what we do. But I believe that opera is a mirror of society. And there are ways that you can tell historic operas from 200 years ago in modern ways, because again, most of the stories that survive are very timeless. Power gone awry. We see that all over the news today. Othering people, that's a pretty common storyline in opera. And I think that we've just really nibbled at a corner of this monument of the possibility here, because for the first 300, 400 years of opera's history, it was almost exclusively composed and produced by Western European men.
Mhm.
And they don't make up more than half of the world's population, And so now we're seeing so many diverse peoples use this art form to tell stories that are important to them. And so I think the possibilities are endless, and I'm extremely bullish. I believe that our best generations of opera are in front of us.
Yeah, maybe this might sound a bit grandiose too, but it sounds like you think we're entering a new era of opera and what opera could be.
For sure. Yeah. Um, Artists are so resilient and so creative. They wouldn't be artists, professional artists, if they weren't those things. And so, I also have this funny meme that I see recirculated every so often that says, like, what's been killing classical music since it started, And a while back, it was the invention of the radio, right? And then it was the invention of the record. And then it was the invention of the CD. And we see vinyl LPs coming back, right? We're even seeing CDs come back now because you can actually own it. A company can't take it away from you, even if you purchase the rights to stream it. So I think that people gathering in community and exploring stories with music, I think that will persist. It might shift a little bit here and there, but I believe it's here to stay.
Yeah, I think so too. Yeah. I'd like to move on to audience development a bit now, something you've also done a lot of work on, because you mentioned before that you're moving beyond traditional demographic segmentation towards targeting people more based on motivation. Specifically, you seem to be focused on what you call curious people, regardless of age. How do you practically identify and reach curious audiences when most platforms and marketing tools are built around your more standard demographics, such as age, income, location data?
For sure. So the first thing, with no disrespect intended, is that marketing platforms are computers and we can tell them what to do, right? We're still in charge, at least in 2025. Long may that continue, I think. Anyway, so that's the first thing to know. The second thing is that when you move beyond the standard demographics, educational attainment, discretionary income, where people grew up, things like that, it unleashes this network of other potential engagement mechanisms that are actually way more powerful. And curiosity, as you mentioned, is one of the big ones that we work with here in Calgary. And that's because if I have someone who's 20 years old and curious, and someone who's 65 years old and curious, I can do the same program for those people, and they're going to get what they want out of it. I don't need to create a young professionals program, a program for longtime donors or 20-year subscribers that presumes that someone has a certain level of knowledge about opera. And when you combine folks with different backgrounds who share a kind of behavioral characteristic, this idea of curiosity, it means that you're actually building community that sustains itself, right? It's not a one-to-one relationship then with an audience member coming to see the opera, getting their own experience and going home. It's two audience members coming to a program that includes a social element, that includes a Q&A as part of it, and then they start to build connections with each other. And one of the things that we know about society, and I think this is true on both sides of the Atlantic, is that we are more lonely and more disconnected than ever. And so one of the unique value propositions of the performing arts is that we bring people together for these shared artistic experiences. So when you can start to build community in that way, people are less lonely, their health outcomes are much better, and it builds a sustainable audience. But we can segment it even more deeply beyond curiosity. I developed something I call an affinity model, which has 7 segments of affinity for something that opera offers people or something that opera is to people. There's sort of 2 characters. There's 4 categories of direct affinity and 3 categories of indirect affinity. And so, for example, one of the categories of direct affinity is story seekers and storytellers. These are people who love to read biographies, who love to study history, who follow Heather Cox Richardson on Facebook, who these are people who seek to understand the past to inform their present day and their future. People who are looking for stories or people who are storytellers in their own right. And opera is imbued with story. So when you are engaging people in your marketing and communications for story seekers and storytellers, you want to engage them through that story lens. For people who are amateur performing artists, they might sing in a church choir. They might take a painting class. They might take a carpentry class, which is art and science altogether. Um, you know, they know something about the artistic, the creative process. And so for those folks, we might engage them in both programming before a main stage performance or, just programming outside of an opera house, for example, and in our communications with the idea of creativity and the creative process. So that's how we have developed our audience, how our audience development work is in process here in Calgary. I've been here a couple of years now, so we're just getting started on these things. But I've implemented this model in Seattle, in Boston, and in the Berkshires in Western Massachusetts. And, in the case of Seattle, we multiplied by 10 the number of people we were engaging outside the opera house on an annual basis, which led to a very successful capital campaign to build Seattle Opera at the Center, their new rehearsal, administrative, and shop space right next to the opera house. And so audience development is part marketing and communications, but for me, it's also programming. We did a study in Seattle when we implemented the affinity model for audience development there. And we found that folks who had engaged in an affinity model program as their first thing, these are adults who, as their first thing they'd done with Seattle Opera, they became full subscribers 50% in 50% less time than through marketing acquisition. And they stayed as full subscribers much longer and became donors much more quickly. And my hypothesis about this is that when you're doing programming that's about curiosity, that's about these affinities, right from the very start, that audience member is receiving something of value, and marketing, again, super essential. Part of why we're talking today, because Culture Suite is, we're implementing the Peppered Web platform. The marketing must follow, it must drive in the way that it can, but it doesn't have an exchange of value right away for someone, right? They see a bus ad going by, they are retargeted with a web banner, those kinds of things. It takes a number of impressions really to bring someone who's new to file. But if you can get them interested in a documentary film about the power of music and show that that's almost exactly like coming to the opera house for a performance, that is a very, very compelling engagement strategy for new audiences.
You've described wonderfully sophisticated and sounds like very successful strategies there, which I'd love to explore more of another time, and share with the sector. But I'm interested, what role does technology play, and how does it fit into your approach to community building and audience development?
Sure. So studies show that one of the things that loyal and new audiences care about the most is how easy it is to buy a ticket. Um, we can bombard people with messaging about the plot of the opera and this musical excerpt and this beautiful costume and all of those kinds of things. But for me, the bar is it as easy to buy a ticket or to reserve your spot in one of our free programs as it is for me to buy a book on the Powell's Book website, or for those who shop on Amazon.com or Amazon.ca? Is it as easy as that? When you look at the Amazon website, the book buying process there has not changed very much since Amazon launched their book selling service, which was a number of years ago now. And nobody actually cares that it isn't like super fancy or whatever, because it serves its purpose. And so for me, I'm keen on the quickest, most efficient transaction pathway, getting people to the information they want as quickly as possible in order to make those choices, and then keeping them coming back for more. So for me, technology is one of the foundations. Just like music is important for opera, marketing and marketing technology is among the most important things in that audience experience of the organization.
I feel like you give a lot of thought to both the audience development side of things and the programming side of things. I wonder if you have any thoughts on, if you could dream up what kind of tool that doesn't exist right now, but that you wished exists, that could help you build deeper, more engaging audiences.
Whew, that's a tough one. What doesn't exist that we need to engage more people? I think it would be somewhat intrusive. Uh, Billboards, signs, things like that, so that when you're driving by one of our digital billboards, that actually the radio in your car turns on and it's playing an excerpt of what's being played on the billboard, right? That there's a way that technology can, and there's always a balance about intrusion, right, in our private lives. But I think if there's a way to make it even more immediately immersive for people, that would be super helpful.
Yeah, yeah, that'll be an interesting one for sure. We're
Well, we'll see you in a year, Matt, you and your colleagues at Culture Suite. How's that?
we'll,
'Cause
we'll have a think about it.
there's nothing like the deadline of curtain going up.
Yeah, yeah. We're just coming up to the end of our time now, so just wanted to wrap up, with one last question. Looking ahead, I just wondered, what gives you most hope and optimism about opera's future?
That because we are based in people and in music and in stories, that there will never be a shortage of ways in which we can tell these stories musically that matter most to people. So, in fact, the hard part is choosing from among all the possibilities for what we do. And so I'm incredibly optimistic about the future of opera, because I also think that as much as technology and streaming and all of these kinds of things have become foundational elements of our lives, I believe that at the end of the day, people will always want to gather in person to share these kinds of experiences. And I believe that our role is to create a more civil society through these caring, connected experiences that the performing arts is among the best at offering people today.
Mhm. And I wonder what advice you'd give to opera leaders who want to create more relevant, engaging programming.
Talk to more people, get their stories, start listening more than we're singing, metaphorically speaking, in the opera, because there's just no shortage. Right now at Calgary Opera, we're juggling about 7 different ideas for bold, innovative new works to unleash here in Calgary. And so I would say listening is the most important skill.
Yeah, I know you interviewed like 400, if not more, people for the refuge. I'll be curious to know how much of that is that a regular occurrence for other opera leaders. I think that's a nice stat for how much listening is done when you've kind of pioneered some of this work. So
For
yeah,
sure, and I would say that there are many opera companies who are doing their best work in their communities that matches their communities now, and, if that's not a testament to the incredible work that, and the wonderful people who shared all those stories for the refuge, then I don't know what else is.
yeah. Well, thank you, Sue. It's been fascinating listening to you. I always enjoy your stories and listen to your innovative approaches to opera programming. And also your thoughtful perspective on balancing artistic tradition with contemporary relevance. I particularly like how you've emphasized artistic humility a few times. I think that's a nice one to remember as well.
Mhm.
For
Yes.
for those interested in learning more about Sue's approach, Calgary Opera's programming reflects these community-focused principles, and the upcoming season promises to continue to push these boundaries and whilst respecting operatic tradition. So it's one that I'll certainly be keeping a close eye on and share any insights and innovations that you guys continue to develop over there.
Thank
To our listeners, if today's conversations have challenged your assumptions about what opera can be, I'd encourage you to seek out contemporary opera in your area. You might discover an art form that's more relevant and surprising than you expected. But other than that, thank you again for sharing your insights with us today, Sue. And thank you to everyone listening and joining this episode of CultureTalk. Until next time, take care and goodbye.